So welcome to the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School. My name is Karen Greenberg. I direct and founded the center. Mostly we do national security. Suzanne, who's going to talk to you in a few moments, talked me into the fact that net neutrality had to do with security at large and how we think about our democracy, which is something the Center on National Security talks about. And so I'm actually delighted that we are doing this. I just want to mention a few things about upcoming events, and I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Suzanne. The first thing I want to mention is that, as you know, and many of you have talked to me about it, we have a conference coming up for the full day on November 3rd that's starting with the director of the FBI, Jim Comey, and has a number of other rather distinguished individuals coming. That event is now closed. If you think you've signed up for it, you might want to talk to me just to double check. There will be a waiting list. There will be a breakout room or two for the overflow. So I just wanted you to know that. On November 10th, we have Lawrence Wright coming to discuss his new book on Camp David called 13 Days in September. And on October 29th, I don't know what order these dates are in, and on October 29th, we have an event on what it means to be a defense attorney at Guantanamo and how handicapped they feel and why. So we have a number of other events. You can check our website if you'd like, but I encourage you to join us at each and every one of them, and I'm going to let Suzanne introduce our panel.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's great to be here. I am Executive Director of PEN American Center. My name is Suzanne Nossel, and PEN American Center is an organization of more than 4,000 writers here in the U.S. who form part of a community of more than 20,000 writers all over the world, joined in a mission to promote and defend freedom of expression and to tear down barriers to communication and understanding worldwide. It was founded after World War I, and it has managed to sustain this dialogue among worldwide writers through the Second World War, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. At the centerpiece of our work at PEN is the defense of threatened and jailed writers worldwide. We did a study of our writers last year, over 350 of them, and discovered that nearly half today have come into jeopardy because of some form of digital communication, a tweet, a Facebook post, a blog post, a video posted on YouTube. So while the printed book is always going to be at the heart of our work at PEN, more and more we're seeing daily that the internet has become as essential to PEN members as the pen itself. It's a tool for research, for collaboration, for writing, and for the dissemination and publication of ideas. Our members include both this country and the world's leading literary lights, people like Yale Doctorow, Toni Morrison, Edward Albee, but also many young writers who are forging their careers right now. Their freedom to write depends on the internet. Their writing habits and their methods have evolved for an internet age. So the upshot is that as a free expression organization in the digital age, PEN has become a de facto digital freedom organization. Because one of the primary tools of our work has always been fostering dialogue, we're delighted to be convening this event today on Open Internet, and once again to be partnering with Fordham's Center on National Security. Our partnership really is premised on the idea that free expression and national security are inextricably intertwined, and we've found a whole succession of topics and issues that illustrate that, and none more so than today. I hope you'll take, if you're not a member of PEN, that you'll take a look at our website, which is just pen.org. Our events lineup this month includes a do-it-yourself series with Justin Vivian Bond at the beginning of November, a prison writing event on the 17th of November with a really stellar lineup. So you can find all of that information on our website, and you can join PEN whether or not you're a writer, and we welcome you and encourage you to do so. There's also literature outside. I'm delighted to now introduce a member of PEN's Board of Trustees, Jacob Weisberg, who has been involved in the internet before the rest of us really knew what it was since 1996, and leads Slate and has been a pioneer in this field. And when we thought about taking on this topic and also how we could translate it for an audience, including both experts and people who see the words open internet or net neutrality and their eyes glaze over, we thought the perfect person to do that translation and to pull together this stellar panel was Jacob. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Karen, and I want to thank Penn and the Fordham Center on National Security for sponsoring this event. We're going to aim to do way better than having your eyes glaze over. We're going to aim for an active elucidation of this interesting and lively and very urgent issue. And I want to start by just briefly introducing the panel, and then I'm going to give them each a chance to make a kind of opening statement, and then we're going to mix it up, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions. So I'm going to start right here with my old friend Micah Sifry. I know Micah going back to when he was a writer for The Nation, but more recently he runs an organization called the Personal Democracy Forum, and he is the author of a new book, which I'm eager to read but haven't read yet, called The Big Disconnect: Why the Internet Hasn't Transformed Politics Yet. Good line. I agree with the premise. To my left is Tim Wu. You may recognize him from his recent unsuccessful but yet wildly successful campaign for lieutenant governor. 39% of the vote.
40.
I think 40%.
Give me some credit here. 40.1.
That's amazing. From a standing start and no background in politics. He's a background as a slate writer. Slate writers tend to overperform in all sorts of unexpected ways. He's the author of a terrific book called The Master Switch, and particularly relevant for today. I believe he coined the term net neutrality, and no discussion of it is really complete without his perspective. And lastly, next to him, Geoffrey Manne was until recently a law professor at Lewis and Clark, and he now runs an organization that he founded, for which I'm going to have to put on my reading glasses to read the title. It's the International Center for Law and Economics. That wasn't that hard. Based in Portland, Oregon. And for the first round here, I would like each of you to be as neutral and descriptive and diagnostic and explanatory as possible, because I think, before we get into the weeds with this issue, I think it's very important to try to have a philosophical perspective, a historical perspective. And I wanted to start with you, Tim,
Sure.
Really kind of explaining where this whole issue of net neutrality, where the idea of net neutrality comes from.
Sure. Well, thanks, and thanks to Penn for having us here and devoting attention to this issue, which has become, as you mentioned, an issue of importance and I think of concern. And I want to try to discuss why I think that is and give some of the historic background. So I went to the FCC the other day to go to a hearing where the chairman was announcing a new rule, and there was a crowd of protesters there. There were people beating drums, camping outside the FCC. And I have to tell you that when I started working on this issue in the early 2000s, we would be lucky to have 10 people show up to a talk or something. It was an obscure academic issue. But I think there's a lot of reasons that net neutrality has become an important issue at our time. And I want to describe some of the issues that I think it raises, the fractures. It raises, in our time, questions about the power, private power in particular, and in particular monopoly power and the exercise thereof. I think there's some concern or some discussion in this country as to whether private power has gone too far. It puts into questions the perennial issue of free speech. The internet has been an incredible engine of speech, and there's some people who feel that, well, maybe that will be threatened. In the sense that there may be a fast lane or slow lane created by lack of net neutrality, it puts into play some of the issues of equality or of inequality, which seems so striking in American society right now. The idea that what feels to many people like public infrastructure might work better for some speakers than for other speakers, I think both raises questions of free speech, but also just of this basic sense of equality. We don't have sidewalks, or we don't usually have sidewalks for rich people and others for poor people, so I think that's time. So if you go back into the history of this issue, you can date it from as far as you want, and I would date it back to even the beginning of the theory of the nation state and of the idea of public infrastructure. One of the things that countries have always done is provide some amount of what you can call infrastructure, that is basic essentials like roads, like bridges, ferries, and so forth, that everyone relies on, all businesses and all citizens. for a very long part of human history, those were always provided by government. The Roman Empire built the roads. That's what made them famous. And in fact, the degree to which a government would build infrastructure was kind of it. That was the description. Now, that began to change about 500 years ago, particularly in England and spreading to the United States, with a model where we would have private actors build what might have otherwise been considered public infrastructure. So have private innkeepers or have private bridge builders or private ferry operators, and then have at least some of them operate under regulation or under rules that gave them public duties. So this is the origins of the idea of a public calling or of a common carrier. And at some level, since the last 500 years, we've been struggling with what exactly the rules should be for these kinds of businesses, which are private businesses, but are somehow vested with a public function. It's not alone to say that infrastructure is like this. In some ways, the press is like this too. I mean, everyone thinks, well, the New York Times or Slate Magazine are businesses, but they seem to be a little different, somewhat more public. Well, when it comes to the internet, what we have is a project originally funded by the government, built in its initial stages by the government, but then later largely taken over by private companies, today dominated by the private sector. And it is the same rule that has been faced forever when we looked in ancient times at bridges or ferries. Should these private operators of what might be described as quasi-public or public facilities have special duties of non-discrimination, delivery of good service, or even perhaps pricing, special pricing rules? Should they have to give this to everyone, make sure we have it? That is the question. We are asking, what are the essentials of the 21st century? And in a certain way, we're asking, is the broadband internet the same as electricity was in the 20th century, or the same that water was in the 20th century? So that's the basic introduction. That's why I think it's so heated. In some ways, it's defining what citizenship is, and I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Geoffrey, I know you're going to want to respond to a lot of that. Before you do,
I tried to be neutral.
Could you just bring us up to speed on where we are in layman's terms on this issue? There have been a few court decisions. The FCC has a ruling pending. There was the interesting spectacle of the president seeming to try to express his opinion in public to the head of the FCC he had appointed, as if he might not know what it was, and it was an opinion strongly in favor of net neutrality. So where are we on this issue right now?
Okay, so briefly, sort of picking up where Tim left off, he started with the beginning of the nation state, and then fast forward to the early 2000s, I guess. Yeah. Yada 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 over everything that happened in between, and we have the internet. We have broadband right now. Telecommunication services have already been regulated by the FCC for many years, since 1934. And along comes this new thing called broadband. And over broadband, as you all know, of course, we do a lot more than just talk to each other, right? It's no longer a single-purpose telecommunications network. Now it's something capable of doing everything. What ultimately came to be characterized by the FCC as an information service. Now, this is important. I won't go into. We already decided we wouldn't go into these annoying legal details, but it's important to note that under the Clinton administration, his first FCC chairman, Bill Kennard, made this determination that we would all be better served if broadband were classified as a quote-unquote information service, which is relevant for our purposes because it's far less regulated than the traditional telecommunications service. After that decision was made, came along some potential challenges to it. The FCC kind of continued on this path and continued to assert that broadband was an information service subject to, to the so-called Title I less regulation. As the debate over net neutrality started to rage on, some people started to suggest that we needed more regulation for the internet. when Michael Powell, now chairman of the Federal Communications Commission under Bush, decided that that was accurate, that indeed some of the arguments that Tim and others had propounded suggested that there was some need to treat the internet a little bit differently, recognizing many of the sorts of ideals that Tim just mentioned. He propounded something called the internet freedoms. Now, this was an aspirational sort of set of goals that suggested things like content should be treated the same on the internet, everyone should have access to all the content they wanted on the internet. And that worked really well until it didn't. And it's not entirely clear, I'll be a little bit contentious here, it's not entirely clear that it ever didn't work. It's only clear that it was asserted not to be working and that we needed some more concrete rules. There were some court decisions, we can elaborate on those later, but there were some court decisions. The court continued to throw out the FCC's effort to impose stronger rules. In 2010, the most fulsome set of rules was promulgated. The court just recently, as you probably all know, in January of this year, threw out those rules as exceeding the FCC's authority to regulate the internet. And now we're where we are today. Those rules have been thrown out. We have a new chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, who is trying to grapple with how to continue some form of regulation of the internet beyond these 4 internet freedoms, but consistent with the limitations that the court imposed. In particular, they couldn't simply reimpose the rules they tried to impose in 2010. So Chairman Wheeler proposes in something called an NPRM another set of rules. Those rules, interestingly enough, were met immediately with a massive outcry, massive opposition. The likes had never been seen, these protesters that Tim was talking about. But this was opposition from the left. This was not the same kind of opposition to regulation of the internet that we had kind of seen before. This was opposition that said, you haven't gone far enough. You have to do something far more substantial here, and in this case, the argument was you have to impose these Title II common carrier regulations. Treat the internet like it's a water utility, like it's an electric utility, as Tim suggested. Mm-hmm. And now we are kind of waiting to see what happens. Chairman Wheeler proposed this set of rules that did not go that far, but asked a number of questions suggesting he would be open to the possibility of the Title II regulation. And we've had millions of pages of debate in the FCC's record about this, millions of hours of events like these, and millions of words and spilled in publications like Jacobs, assessing really right now this question whether we should treat the internet like a common carrier or something less than that. But, and maybe this can be a good segue for you, the issues underlying regulation of the internet at all in this fashion, whether it's anything ranging from the internet freedoms up to treatment like a common carrier, are kind of what we want to talk about here rather than, I think, debating the merits and demerits of the very arcane, specific legal rules. I think we can do that despite the fact that where we are right now is really asking this question, whether we're going to be regulating the internet under Title II or something less than that.
That was precisely the right amount of explanation. Thank you. Micah, before we go right back into that, I just want to ask you about the political stakes here. I mean, this is often framed as an issue of the open internet versus closed internet, an issue of free expression, an issue of political expression. I mean, is it, I was, the week before last, I was in Turkey having a bunch of meetings about press freedom there. And there, in Turkey, which is a democracy, the president recently got a law passed saying essentially he could take down anything from the internet at will, and immediately began to do so with things he politically disagreed with. Now, there, the political stakes, the political censorship of the internet is very clear. Here we're talking about differential bandwidth speeds, download times. I mean, isn't this rhetoric a little inflated to frame it that way?
Well, is this on, by the way?
I think you're okay.
So, there's no question we're not living in Turkey. Though, just to stay on that example for a second, it's not on. Here we go. Okay. Now on?
Yeah,
okay. Just to stay on the Turkey example for a second, it's worth noting that when those protests broke out about a year ago in Gezi Park over a government proposal to bulldoze a park and put up a shopping mall and to do so against the wishes of the local community, the state media and the private broadcast media in Turkey didn't cover this at all, and it was only because people in Turkey had access to services like Twitter that they were able to get the news out of what was going on with people protesting in the streets, so that the freedom to connect through relatively open services like Twitter is really absolutely vital to any hope for an open society. We here in the United States, it's worth trying to cast your mind back to maybe 20 plus years ago, before we had the internet at all, before we had social networking, before we had blogs, before we had email. We just had mainstream media, and it was a fairly a much more closed system. If you wanted to be heard by the larger society, you had to get through a gatekeeper. You had to convince an editor at an op-ed page or at a journal of opinion like Slate that what you had to say was valuable. And those gatekeepers were not a particularly diverse group. And we had a much more constrained national conversation as a result. So what we have now is absolutely a much better situation in terms of a more open media system, thanks to the open internet. But that said, I think that this argument about net neutrality is part of a larger argument over the merits of open versus closed systems. And I think I can illustrate this with a recent example, because the fact of the matter is that there are services on the internet that are more open and there are services that are more closed. And that this philosophical issue of whether everybody has equal access and equal opportunity to reach everyone else with their message is playing out in real time in many other ways, not just this question of whether the owners of the pipes have to not discriminate in terms of the content that they carry and what they charge for that content. So you may remember about 2 months ago when it was in the middle of the summer, and there was Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, and there were protests in the streets there almost from the beginning. Now, if you were on Twitter and just glancing at what was coming through your own feed, the odds are that you probably saw fairly quickly that there were a lot of angry and upset people in the streets of Ferguson, and people were sharing pictures of the police in their RoboCop uniforms and so on. But if you were on Facebook, you didn't see this at all in your news feed for the first few days. What you actually saw was something else. You saw the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Now, the reason why so many people saw the Ice Bucket Challenge on Facebook as opposed to the Ferguson Challenge, if you will, was because Facebook has a much different algorithm for deciding what it's going to put in your news feed than Twitter. Basically, Facebook is putting things into your news feed that it thinks you're going to like to see, and I think also behind it is Facebook has a commercial interest in not upsetting its users. They want to keep their users there and happy and in a mood to maybe pay attention to Facebook's advertisers. Twitter and its algorithm is much more directed by what you, the user, choose to follow, right? You may choose your friends on Facebook, but that doesn't mean you see all the information that your friends share. Facebook, because it can, throttles the news feed and, in fact, will charge you to reach all your friends, right?
Yeah,
the point is simply that this issue of the neutrality of these services that we rely on, it is absolutely vital to whether or not we have an open and robust conversation or one that is in all kinds of ways subtly shaped and throttled and limited by private interests.
Okay, I'm not sure I totally agree with you about how Facebook's algorithm works, but I don't think we need to get into that further. I do want to go right back into this question about the internet as a public utility or not. So you use the metaphor of sidewalks, water, electricity. Now there is the issue with if bandwidth is like electricity, you pay, the more you use, the more you pay. It doesn't necessarily work that way. But in practice, I mean, isn't this mainly really from the point of view of the carriers, a commercial issue about whether they can charge more to the people who use the most of it?
No.
Why not?
I don't think that's the issue. That's how it's framed in order to rhetorically suggest that this is a simple issue the government should stay away from. But I think it is much more complicated than that. Or if it is, I mean, anything can be expressed as well as simply payments. But if it were, that hides the complexity of the issue. So my position, now we're in the advocacy side, is I do think in our era that the internet has become one of the essentials and should be regarded as a public utility. I think there was maybe a different story 15 years ago when we were trying to incentivize broadband rollout. I think it's come to the point where you go in a new apartment or a new business, you start it, you want electricity, you want water, and you want broadband. And what you want from the broadband carrier is that it be reliable, as cheap as possible, and for the service to give you what you want and not to itself impose its own strange little speed ups or slowdowns or whatever else. Now, what the carriers have long wanted, and I can understand the economic reason for this, is the ability to differentially tax different speakers on the internet. So for those who have more to pay, they'd like to charge them more and basically create a fast lane and slow lane. Now, there's some economic justifications for those kind of deals, but I think the public interest augurs against it. And again, it comes to the idea that there are some businesses which are in the nature of public infrastructure. I'll give you an example. If you imagine the Brooklyn Bridge, I could say the George Washington Bridge, but that's more politically loaded. But if you imagine the Brooklyn or George Washington Bridge were privately owned and say favored one pizza delivery company over another or one taxi line over another, I think you can sort of immediately see how that begins to distort competition. Well, we favor Uber, and Uber has a competitor named Lyft. We did a deal. Uber gets over the bridge, the other guys don't. Or Uber gets over in a fast lane, these guys slow down. That immediately tips competition in favor of Uber, for example. And I think in a way that actually hurts the internet. Because it derails a fair competition. And then I'll also say that when we talk about speech, the idea that rich speakers get better access to people is to some degree inevitable, but I don't think we should try to facilitate it. One thing that's been exciting and interesting about the internet is that it has achieved a rough parity. Not perfect parity, and you still have to be good, but it is possible for a really well-informed, thoughtful blogger to compete with the opinion page of the New York Times or to compete with Fox News or whatever it is. And that is a function of them being able to reach people at relatively the same speeds. In a world of great inequality, we already have enough inequality as it is, I think, in our society. We don't need more. Now I'm starting to get political. Don't need more expressed on the internet and have it be that the only people who get hurt are the people who have money, because we have enough of that problem already.
So Geoffrey, I mean, this question of public utility ties in a little bit to the question of whether something is a natural monopoly, right? I mean, electricity and water pretty clearly are. There are a lot of places where you have more than one way of accessing broadband internet, right? And it may be, it may be a temporary condition that it functions like a monopoly for, say, consumers in New York. It certainly does for me. I only have one way to get broadband where I live. But I look forward to
me may only have one way of getting cable broadband, but you can access it through AT&T U-verse or Verizon Fios. I don't know which is.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be available in everybody's neighborhood, but then again, in 5 years it might, and we're presumably looking forward to that period. So anyway, speak to this question of whether Tim's right that this is a public utility and should be treated like a public utility.
Okay, well, so to answer your immediate question, to the extent that the issue may be an economic one, it may be a problem of monopoly. If that's the basis for the regulation here, the fear that there might be anti-competitive conduct by a monopoly that doesn't face a sufficient amount of competition, we actually have laws that deal with that and deal with it pretty well. They're called antitrust laws. We also have consumer protection laws. So it begs the question in part, I'm not saying that there isn't an answer to this, but it certainly begs the question in part, why and whether we need to build an enormous new apparatus to try to achieve this thing that at root is a problem of, perhaps, if it's a problem, of not sufficient or insufficient competition when we have laws that deal specifically with that. On some of the issues that Tim was talking about, essentially the implications of that, whether it's true or not, I definitely take issue with the characterization of much of this, and in particular with the characterization of what the effects would be of allowing prioritization and what the effects would be of mandated neutrality. And one thing to recognize is that we have nothing approaching neutrality right now. Nothing at all. There is nothing neutral about the internet. What's most interesting is that far from constraining Bob Loblaw's law blog from being able to access everyone it wants to access in the world, the parties that are actually advocating for more regulation, for common carrier sort of treatment here, are enormously rich. Netflix, Google, Facebook, companies like that are the ones who are advocating net neutrality here. Now that should give you a bit of pause. You should wonder whether there's any reason to think that they're advocating for the little guy, the little pizza company who's allegedly going to be harmed if he doesn't have access to the fast lane on the Brooklyn Bridge, or whether there might be something else going on. One of the things that I think we should consider is going on here is that prioritization is actually really, really useful and important precisely for the startup, for the unknown company that needs some way of trying to distinguish itself from the incumbent. The incumbent has a massive consumer base, easy access to financing, name recognition, all kinds of things. And along comes this new little piddly startup who's constantly looking for ways to try to distinguish itself and make sure that the incumbent's customers can find this new guy. Now, unfortunately, like it or not, especially in a world where we have so much information out there, it isn't enough just to be better. You also have to find a way to make sure that the people who are your potential customers know that you're better. Well, one potential way of doing that is actually getting some form of prioritization. You can call it advertising or promotion. It's effectively the same thing. And I can tell you one thing that I think is a likely consequence if we foreclose any ability for the startup or anyone else to access this form of prioritization. It can only mean they will be spending more money on other forms of promotion and prioritization, which in the first instance probably means buying more ads on Google. Now, didn't I just mention that Google was in favor of net neutrality? There's a possible explanation for why. I also would just add one, I would add 100 additional points, but let me add one in particular just because I happen to have this great quote from Tim, and it's useful to bring it out. Tim says, consider that when you get in a New York taxi, the driver must charge you the posted rate and take you where you want to go. That's common carriage in action. I think that's right. But Title II, treating the internet like common carriage, is like outlawing Uber. The problem with common carriage, the problem with over-regulating the internet, is that it locks the internet into a kind of status quo. As a matter of requirement, if you're going to impose regulations, they're going to be imposed in ways that outlaw certain conduct that we can conceive of and allow other conduct that we can conceive of. And most of the conduct that we can conceive of is conduct that is happening right now. It will enshrine those forms of conduct and actually impede innovation, new business models, new ways of structuring not just the internet, but the very edge providers, the content providers who are allegedly the beneficiaries of this net neutrality regime. I think we have to be really careful before we impose, essentially mandate the business models on the internet of yesterday. We better be sure that we're not outlawing the business models of tomorrow by doing that.
Well, just to characterize, it's interesting because there is some real common ground between the two of you. You both think it's worked, the internet has worked pretty well so far. Yeah. But you, Tim, think it's partly because companies haven't been able to differentiate. They haven't been able to commercially regulate the market and say you're going to go faster. The carriers, yes. And Geoffrey, you think the risk is government regulating the internet. But really both of you like it pretty well the way it works now. Yeah. And the question is in a way what the definition of an unregulated internet, an internet without unhealthy regulations. And you see the unhealthy regulation as government, and you see the unhealthy regulation as what the carriers would do without government.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
But unlike the carriers acting without regulation, the government actually has an obligation before it imposes regulations to defend them. And so the carriers can do what they want, like it or not, unless and until they run afoul of the laws, primarily the antitrust laws. But the government actually has to defend its imposition of regulation. And one of the big issues here, at least to me, is that there's really, as we were just discussing, there's almost no evidence that anything bad has ever happened. There's a couple of tiny things, there's a couple of little tiny things. Well, we can debate the significance of the 3 examples that anyone can come up with. But generally speaking, as Tim just agreed, the internet works pretty well right now. And the real question is there, even if there are things that might have gone wrong, is there enough evidence to defend a shift really a paradigm shift in regulation? Or actually, is there not enough? And while there might be some problems down the road, perhaps the only valid course right now is restraint and humility, and we should wait until the problems actually materialize, because we don't have enough evidence to justify imposing stringent regulations now.
So I just wanted to object to this consensus that the internet works pretty well right now. Most of us are being overcharged for service that would, that we should be embarrassed by. We're paying first world prices for third world service, and a kid in South Korea can get to the Library of Congress website 100 times faster than a kid in the South Bronx. If that kid in the South Bronx can even afford to buy broadband service from one of the monopolists who may not even be choosing to put fast service in to their neighborhood, because they've already cherry-picked the rich neighborhoods to put the fast service into. There were a lot of premises that just got thrown past us there. The idea that, Jacob, we might in 5 years see more competition or faster services being provided when Verizon has already said that they are not going to build Fios out any further than it already has done. Really, for most people, unless you want to pay exorbitant prices or move to one of the few cities that either Google or a city municipality is putting this new gigabit level of internet service, we are never going to catch up to what large chunks of the rest of the industrialized world take for granted at prices a fraction of what we pay. So let's not blithely say that the internet works well now, and from the consumer point of view, it doesn't work well at all.
Right, and to be clear, I think what I meant was we agree that it works well in terms of fostering innovation and encouraging free expression.
But he makes a good point. It's important not to. The net neutrality is part of a broader debate as to how do we feel about private power in telecom, and I would side with the view that the antitrust laws have been inadequate in this area, and that we have serious problems, and we should open the door, as time goes by, to thinking of things. If you have a continued trend, as the trend has been, towards more consolidation, towards just a few companies being in charge, and over a pretty important public facility, I think that naturally invites, even by any economist's description, monopoly. A company with a monopoly that shows no sign of disappearing at all, or 2 companies that are charging monopoly prices, at some point you've got to say, that's it, enough of monopoly extraction, here's the price you're going to charge. There's no question. The case for rate regulation is strong. The case for and also saying you need to provide access to more people in exchange for this monopoly is strong, and that's what we did with the telephone service. That's what we did at points with cable. And I'm not saying at this moment that is necessary, but I don't want to totally close the door when we have unconstrained monopoly power. The government should never say, we are going to let a monopolist charge way in excess of the prices that its costs are at for an unlimited duration because the internet is special. There's no reason to have that kind of rule. The government needs to supervise monopoly and needs to keep prices. One of the things I'm concerned about, this is an inequality issue in this country, is the sense that while middle-class salaries are flat, the essentials keep getting more and more expensive. Internet service being one example, cell phone service being another great example. These prices all keep going up. And so that creates a real diminishment in real income. And so some of these issues are not just techie issues. They're starting to become important issues of basically what it means to be middle class in this country. So I don't think we should take those issues off the table.
No, and I think this is an important predictive question that's relevant to this debate, which is whether the carriers are going to become more like monopolies or less like monopolies. I think it's fair to say that most people experience them now as companies that behave like monopolies. I certainly do. But I'm not at all confident that I don't know which way it's going to go. I mean, I think there may be real competition in markets that don't have much of it down the road, or it may go in the other direction. What do we think?
Well, I think making net neutrality policy on the basis of the fact that people hate Comcast is a really bad idea.
But if Comcast is a monopoly and is going to stay a monopoly,
but it's not clear that Comcast is a monopoly. I mean, as I said, there is obviously at least one other competitor in just about everywhere in the country. If we're talking about broadband here, and it's actually true for cable as well. But let's focus on broadband. There is AT&T or Verizon at pretty much everywhere in the country. There are other options as well, CenturyLink and other companies that are all investing enormously in their networks. And one of the things that's hard to figure out is why these rapacious monopolists have invested trillions, literally trillions of dollars, and have demonstrated ever-improving speeds relative to the costs of content and various other costs, not especially rapid increases in prices. Prices have generally gone up, but I don't think massively
not especially.
so.
Wait, that's not true. The prices have gone up way faster than inflation.
No? Oh, faster than inflation, but not nearly as fast as
18 times
content
as fast as
costs,
inflation. Well, the
then
content
we're
costs
talking
is
about
driving it.
right.
You're talking about cable video.
Right. But the point is that we are not experiencing exactly. I mean, I understand people hate Comcast. Their customer service is terrible. You'd all rather pay less than we pay for whatever it is we want. I mean, all of these things are true, but we have to be really careful about translating that kind of conflict again into, and here I want to bring this back to net neutrality, into the very specific and detailed and potentially counterproductive rules that we're talking about here. Because we're not, Tim, maybe this was sort of a burst of honesty on your part. What you're really saying here is, what I really want is a backdoor way to essentially nationalize this infrastructure that I believe should be offered essentially by the government, or at the very minimum regulated so heavily by the government that it's essentially indistinguishable from if the government were offering it. That's not what net neutrality was originally about, and that's not what these rules are intended, that's not the problem these rules are intended to address. If that's the problem you see, then we should talk about that differently. But so again, I don't agree with the premises here, but most importantly, I think there's a real problem with going from those premises to imposition of Title II common carrier status for the benefit of the supposed problems, or for the benefit of solving the supposed problems that we have in the net neutrality debate.
My position is the amount of regulation. I don't have a fixed idea on the right amount of regulation.
Sure.
I think it has a lot to do with the amount of competition. I've been involved in the telecom sector for 15 or more years now, and I've been waiting for the supposed market entry of 4 or 5, 6, if this become a rigorous competitive market for delivering cable and internet service. And I'm happy Verizon built to some very high expensive neighborhoods. I'm happy that Google has wired 2 cities. But overall, the state of competition is poor and is nothing like what was promised. And when that happens, when you wait, you have to, as opposed to sitting there and saying, well, one day competition will come, and so we shouldn't do anything because one day competition might be coming. I think we need to act and restrain what are. You're saying we shouldn't do this because we hate Comcast. Well, you got to act on the facts. Comcast is acting like an unrestrained monopolist. No, they raise their prices at every chance they have. You don't like the word monopoly? We'll use the word duopoly.
They invest trillions in the infrastructure, and continually, every year, increase speeds significantly. And when you take account of the government subsidies, the tax subsidies that are offered in these other countries that are supposedly offering much better service, the service isn't necessarily much better, and it costs more. I mean, it's really easy to sort of criticize what we have, but it's actually not at all clear that what we have is worse than what others have, nor more expensive. And then, again, relevant, I think, more relevant to the neutrality debate is what are the costs that we're bearing of this if it's the case that our service isn't as good as South Korea's, and perhaps that's one of one or two countries where that's true. What are we losing for that, and how much cost and burden are we willing to bear in order to correct this potentially very small actual cost?
Well, can I get right in the heart of net neutrality then? So net neutrality, the internet has been an economic golden goose that's laid some very valuable eggs for this country. America has, to give credit to the internet, 20 years ago, people were asking if the United States was kind of finished as a technological power. It seemed like Japan, other countries were ahead. There's very little question when you look at the world's top 10 tech companies, they're almost all American. America has and I think being the home of the internet, of an open internet, of a neutral internet, has not everything, but a lot to do with that. And you had said that, well, startups actually would do better on a pay-to-play internet where they can pay for it. And there's just that's just a mythology. If you ask the startups themselves, they're like, we don't want to start our business negotiating with Comcast or Verizon for an extra payment when we have no money compared to our direct competitor, who would be someone like Google, or would be or Airbnb, or an established company who has a lot more money. It's clear that the non-neutral internet favors incumbents, which is, it's not just Google who's in favor. When you look at who files comments in favor of net neutrality, it's New York tech companies, it's like Vimeo, Spotify, it's companies who are struggling to get into the market and know they would be destroyed if Comcast or Time Warner.
Let's go into that.
They would be hurt. I don't think they'd be destroyed, but they would definitely. And sometimes they'd be destroyed.
How is it any different?
Let me just interrupt a second here, because I want to pursue exactly this point, which is the question of what the absence of net neutrality would likely look like. I was just thinking about one example. I mean, it's not broadband access, but the wireless carriers are now, Verizon, for example, is offering certain content with no data charges attached to it. Now, that just comes in the form of a kind of, it's not directly translatable, but that turns out to be very appealing to people. The idea that you won't run up data charges if you're reading certain things, watching certain things. But what would, if we didn't, I mean, there's sort of the, dystopian version, but what's the kind of realistic version of what happens if the FCC doesn't mandate net neutrality going forward?
You get more of those things. I mean, now there are people who are very critical.
And that's a good thing or a bad thing in your view?
It's a great thing.
Really?
It's a form
So our media
of
will
subsidy.
begin to look more and more like television again.
How do you mean?
Well, television is free, but only to the extent that it's paid for by advertisers. And so if you aren't somebody who can attract a lot of advertising, you never get on television. The idea that, I mean, what you're describing, Jacob, is already exists in parts of the third world. It's called Facebook Zero. And what Facebook is doing with mobile phone providers in Africa and Asia is saying, everybody wants Facebook. We'll let you bundle Facebook with your phone. And if people just open the phone to get onto Facebook, there won't be any data charges. And so from the point of view of a user, like, wow, I'm getting Facebook for free. What they don't realize is that they're actually not getting onto the internet at all.
Well, they may actually know that. I think it's the height of first world hubris to say, screw you, I know you want Facebook, but you can't have it because I can imagine something that would be better for you. And you don't even know how bad it is.
Yes, I do think we have a value difference here, which is that an open system is better than a closed system. So I don't think I can be neutral about that.
Well, if an open system means no internet at all, and a closed system means at least I get Facebook, I would definitely take the closed system. Because that may be the relevant choice. That may be the relevant choice for many people who can't afford anything more.
Let me stay in the United States for a second. How do I think things would look? I mean, I don't think that, the walls would fall down, Fordham Law School would continue to function, things like that would happen. But I think it would be a considerably different world for people who are thinking of starting new things. I mean, think about Slate magazine starting in the 90s when you were there, or all the range of online magazines that are starting right now. You have an idea, you put it out there, and you see whether it works or not. So many startups, that's how they start, and they either take off or they don't.
And they didn't need anyone's permission.
The position where you start with a position where you need to negotiate a deal or you know that you're going to be at a huge disadvantage if you don't have a deal with Verizon, Comcast, with big 3 or 4 people, it starts becoming a permission-driven system. The internet becomes something where it's all about who has got the better deal as opposed to meritocratic. In my view, it starts to look a lot more like cable television. The internet finally follows the path of cable, which was born about the same time as the internet. Right. They've been different, and basically it becomes much more commercial. I'll say the final thing is probably it'll entrench this generation of internet companies. Facebook is quiet on net neutrality. Google is actually relatively quiet too, other than sort of a old ideal, because they know that in a non-neutral world, they have the money to pay to get access over their competitors. They could destroy or advantage themselves over any potential serious competitors. So I think it locks in the current incumbents. You see Facebook, Google, Amazon, those companies not overthrown, and they stick around for much longer than we might think.
Facebook, Google, and Amazon are quiet in this. Remember, I said that the real debate we're having right now is over Title II. It's over whether we're going to impose common carrier rules, not whether we're going to have net neutrality at all. Those companies are all in favor of net neutrality, and I believe in private conversation are probably opposed to paid prioritization as well. They're opposed to Title II, common carrier sort of rules, because there is no evidence, there's no reason to think that those rules won't apply to them as well. And it's another danger here of the imposition of this massive regulatory apparatus that, be careful what you wish for, because you may end up hamstringing the very parts of the ecosystem, these content providers and edge providers, that you're supposed to be benefiting by this. But Tim, I don't know, I think your vision of what the world's going to look like is too pessimistic. I don't think there's anything to suggest that that's likely to be the case, in large part because we don't have any rules prohibiting paid prioritization right now, and that isn't what it looks like today. But also because I think if you kind of work through the economics of it, you realize that that's not very clearly beneficial to the internet service providers either. They don't have a great. We may disagree on exactly where they would fall and what amount of sort of unfettered content is in their best interest, but it's very clear that. Take an example that's much in the news today. Netflix and Comcast are not simply at odds with each other. People pay for Comcast broadband precisely in part because they can get Netflix from it. And you have to be aware that there is that synergy that exists. The broadband provider that doesn't own sufficient content to attract people to the internet has to make sure that they're offering content. So
they could just offer great service.
What's that?
Or they could just offer great service, which they don't.
Well, but they would still need the content. And my point is again, I don't know exactly where it would fall out. I can see margins on which the internet service provider might deter or impede some content providers, but in general, I think they have a very strong interest in people getting access to what they want, because that's why people are willing to pay for broadband. And one other thing really quickly is just that again, this vision is of the small garage startup not being able to get access, but Comcast, for example, doesn't care about them. Comcast could care less whether the small startup is clogging its pipes, because it won't clog its pipes at all. It cares about Netflix because Netflix actually, and it's absolutely the truth, really does impose some really difficult engineering problems on Comcast network. It's not made up, they really do. But the small garage startup, until they become the size of Netflix, Comcast doesn't even know they exist. And so again, now you could create a scenario, a world in which some evil person comes to Comcast and says, "I hate these people. It's run by Jews. Let's stop them. We don't want them on the internet." And you can construct that, but that's just not really likely how it's going to work out. How it's really going to work out is Netflix is going to have to pay Comcast, and its next competitor is going to sail through because Comcast won't even know it exists.
It's straightforward. These are for-profit companies. I don't think they're, although cable companies sometimes are tempted to think they're evil, but I don't think they're evil. But they'll favor whoever has more money, and so the internet will just start to resemble the rest of the paid media, and it's already quite a long ways along there. But there are at least a few spaces left in American society. I think is one of it where smaller speakers have a decent chance. And I don't think Comcast cares about different groups, but it does care about who pays it. And it's clear to me that the speakers with money will get priority, and you'll gradually see the speakers with less money, let's say like Wikipedia, which is always struggling for money, doesn't run any ads. The other thing is the consumer experience will get worse, because in order to pay Comcast, Time Warner, whatever, places like Wikipedia will have to say, well, I guess we have to start running ads in order to... So the consumer will always pay in the end, whether it's by seeing more ads or whether Wikipedia will be raising money more frequently.
Wikipedia, which has, by the way, a Wikipedia Zero, which
But
is
I'm
an
just saying,
agreement with
Wikipedia is
mobile
exactly the
carriers
kind of
to
content that will
prioritize
get
their
hurt on
access.
a non-neutral internet. It came out of nowhere, it has no good profit model, but people rely on it all the time, and it's exactly the kind of content that why would Comcast you let that go any faster than someone with a lot of money?
I'm going to open this up for questions just a minute, but I just want to ask whether...
I didn't hear. Who is it?
Wikipedia, he said.
That was at the end. You were talking about Wikipedia.
Yeah, Wikipedia.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but just a question for any of you, or all of you can answer. Is the Amazon Hachette dispute relevant here? Because here you have, not technically a monopoly, but a company with vast market power discriminating against specific content, and it's now down to the level of individual authors, because the story in the Times last week said they gave Paul Ryan a pass, even though he's a Hachette writer. Yeah. And it's a commercial dispute, but they now have the power to do significant harm to exactly the kind of people you're talking about. I mean, isn't that, and there's no net neutrality that applies or really could apply to Amazon, but is that the kind of thing that you're worried about here?
Yeah, I think that we need to be worrying about these new concentrations of power and whether they are using their platforms in a neutral way or not. And I think we can extend the logic that Tim gave us in talking about the net as a neutral platform to think about Amazon's role here. And that is absolutely worrisome, and I'm not saying that we have to defend the old publishing model, and hold everything in amber, but playing favorites in the way that Amazon seems to be doing is very troubling.
Geoffrey, are you cool with what Amazon is doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will take a sort of devil's advocate role for the purpose of pushing the net neutrality discussion a little bit further, and just point out that as you said, net neutrality applies only to the internet service providers. It doesn't apply to any of the other alleged gatekeepers that Tim has written about. And I think it's really worth thinking through what happens when you mandate neutrality on one level of this internet ecosystem, but can't or don't on others. There's this recent dispute between YouTube and independent artists who are not getting free access on YouTube anymore unless they pay for exposition of their videos on YouTube. There are any number of examples, and Amazon and its authors is another example. There are any number of aggregators out there who are as much gatekeeper. If Comcast is a gatekeeper to the internet, for an author, Amazon is as much of one. For an independent artist, YouTube is as much of one. You can think of thousands of examples like that. And that creates two sort of important and countervailing points that really have to be considered here. On the one hand, it means that, again, I mentioned Bob Loblaw's law blog before. If Comcast wanted to stop Bob Loblaw's law blog, it would be really easy, except for the fact that Bob Loblaw's law blog is on WordPress, and WordPress isn't a Scott Baio. No, not Scott Baio. Damn, what's his name?
Matt Mullenweg?
No, the guy in Arrested Development. He did not. Anyway. Who is it? No, it's the other. Okay, anyway, that's not the point. The point is that it's not Bob Loblaw's law blog standing on its own. It's WordPress, and WordPress, or again, when it comes, it's not Adele versus Comcast. It's YouTube versus Comcast, and that's really important to bear in mind. That a lot of the independent and small access artists and creators and innovators, their access to the internet comes through aggregation services that may have problems that we can discuss, but they also help to counteract the perceived problems of having an ISP as a gatekeeper. Because again, it's Google versus Comcast, which is a much fairer fight than than Comcast versus Scott Baio.
But many of them are non-commercial or not-for-profit. But
very few of them that really matter and are successful. Wikipedia is one of very few examples. And I'm not saying this is across the board, this happens everywhere, but just think about the fact that that dynamic does exist and helps to moderate or ameliorate some of the perceived problems, because again, there are very powerful entities who are potentially threatened by this rapaciousness on Comcast's part, and they're not going to sit idly by. But the flip side of this that I mentioned a second ago is also that if you take away Comcast as a potential break on Amazon, Facebook, Google, whoever else as a intermediary on the internet, you are potentially increasing their power. And all of a sudden you've just shifted the locus of any potential problem from Comcast to Google or YouTube or Amazon. Now, in the net neutrality debate, again, now I'm being my devil's advocate, let's say you're absolutely right about everything that's going on with respect to Amazon. Are we better off if Amazon has, sort of unfettered ability, no potential impediment to doing whatever it wants to do from the ISP direction? Or are they potentially
I don't understand how Comcast is serving a check on Amazon. So if Amazon,
because
if
Comcast cares.
No, hold on. So if Comcast is taxing, grabbing all kinds of random money out of companies, trying to tax Slate so it has to have more ads and do all this kind of stuff. Well, that's bad. And then Amazon is doing something else that's bad. Why is that?
Well, it's a more
normally when you look
example,
at problems,
if you
it's
look
like,
at,
well, we have a problem with
YouTube, it's a more obvious
robbery,
example.
and we have a problem with, and over here we have a problem with kidnapping. It's like, well, don't you need to solve both those problems? I mean, it's not like they cancel each other out.
Let me just interject 1 second, because I want to take a few questions. We only have about 10 minutes left, so you can keep talking, but let me see if there are any hands. People have questions. And if you do have a question, and you can go first, but tell us your name and ask one quick question, please.
Quick question.
Yes.
My name is Melissa Kornick. I'm with a fellowship program at the Poynter Institute called Sense Makers, and we're making sense of fact-driven information on the internet. I used to do investigative reporting for 60 Minutes, Dateline 2020, all these shows. I'm finding that you absolutely cannot have the same effect on something that improves society in some way, where you get somebody out of prison or a new vaccine or whatever, on the internet. It just doesn't happen. So it's sort of like the public interest, the public good. The internet smokes out in its own, fashion, very slowly, compared to having everybody look at a topic at the same time in different stratas of society where you can actually impact a change. So where do you see the internet having the same effect as legacy media did?
Okay, well, if I understand your question correctly, what you're saying basically is back in the good old days, a program like 60 Minutes or a network news show could really focus our attention on a problem, and that would often lead to some fix. And that today we actually have a new kind of problem, which is we have a oversupply of information. If anything, the internet has made it too easy for us to speak. This is actually a topic I take up in my new book. What do we do about this? How do we actually refocus? Yeah. Well, I actually would say that the reasons why, there are many reasons why our in the United States at least, it seems as though our political and governmental system is dysfunctional and problems don't get solved. They just the blame gets pointed back and forth. And I would just suggest that part of the problem is that our attention wanders too quickly now. And we go from crisis to crisis, and the system that used to then sort of respond is immediately distracted and onto something else, and that the internet is causing a kind of societal attention deficit disorder. We all feel it personally in our need to constantly check for the latest email, the latest tweet, the latest this, instead of sticking on things. And I think that this may be something we can grow ourselves out of as we learn to better filter the media that we're all being surrounded with now. That's an open question, and I'm hopeful that we can do that. But I think you're absolutely right. It is a problem today.
Other questions? If not, we can just continue the argument we were having a second ago. But yes, sir. Yeah. Here comes the microphone on your other side. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Plant. I'm Deji Olukusin from Pan American Center. So last week my internet stopped working. I have Time Warner, And it turned out that, which we haven't really mentioned up, and we haven't talked about the merger. So actually, that's the underlying question. Excuse me. But what happened was Time Warner had actually stopped my service in order so that I could upgrade. So they said you've qualified, and this probably, I'm guessing if, excuse me, if other people also have Time Warner, maybe this happened to them, but they were offering me a better modem at 50 megabits per second, and I had 20. And the way they got my attention and to offer that was to shut off my service.
You know,
I do not think that was an isolated example, because that, from over the phone, that was a policy.
Not only is that not an isolated example, precisely the same thing happened to me. Precisely. It's unbelievable.
So that's a monopoly.
When you talk about monopolistic behavior, it's a little bit what you're talking about. But I mean, we could, if we're going to start telling Time Warner horror stories, we could be here.
Well, there's a merger, but the question,
evening,
there's a merger, Comcast Time Warner
Right.
merger. That's on the. We haven't talked about that and what that would mean, and that's part of the leaving things as they are. The antitrust agency might step in, but they might not. So
I'll go first. I believe strongly the merger should be blocked. I think we already have a problem with unresponsive, overly concentrated power in the cable sector, and I think the merger would make it worse. And it's not only some of the net neutrality things are implicated, and I've tried to stick with them, but I actually think prices is the thing that bothers me. Comcast, Time Warner, the average bill for Time Warner, which is 1992 was probably it was like between $12 and $20. It's grown to the average Time Warner bill $105. A lot of it's programming, but it has grown outlandishly. And the average Comcast bill is $155 per customer.
Per month?
Per month. Yeah. And so, you know, if Comcast succeeds in getting the same money out of New Yorkers that it got out of everybody else, that'll mean in this state alone, $1.6 billion a year extra for consumers will pay to the cable companies. I think cable companies are making enough money as it is. I think the merger should be stopped. Comcast has not said anything as to what would be in the public interest. Everything they say are these sort of vapid, empty, like, you know, we'll be delivering next generation services for your, and when they try and back it up, they're just competitors with internet services, like their replacement for Netflix, which makes them money as opposed to Netflix or something. So I think the merger, there's nothing about the merger I've read that makes it in the public interest. And the burden, you know, back in the 20s, the progressive era, or in the 10s, when people looked at this problem of over-concentration, they're like, well, we need to not allow mergers for these kind of industries when they're not in the public interest. Comcast has yet to meet their burden of proof or production on the public interest. Merger should be stopped. Simple
As
to
an
me.
antitrust matter, they don't bear a burden of proof or production. At the FCC, they
do, and at the Public
the
Service
FCC,
Commission in New York.
Okay, fine. But not as a matter of antitrust. And since 1910, we've had an enormous amount of economics that we actually have developed and innovated in economics since then, and we've learned, among other things, that concentration does not translate into monopoly power or anti-competitive effects. This merger in particular would happen to replace, in New York, it would replace Time Warner with Comcast. Now, you actually have to make out, as an economic matter, you actually have to make out a case why replacing one monopolist with another is why you're likely to have anti-competitive outcomes that are actually relevant to the merger. And the fact of the matter is there aren't any.
Didn't I mention some price differentials about 1 minute ago?
You mentioned that they exist, and they exist in different markets and with different products. And I'm sure that Comcast would tell you, well, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure Comcast would say our service is better. We give you something more, and we charge more for it. You'd have to do a quality adjustment to whatever data you're throwing around. But I don't think you can say that they'll simply replace the exact same internet that was costing you $105 with something for $155. They might, but I don't think there's any reason to think they will.
Okay, we're going to have a last question right here, and hopefully it will give you each a chance for a brief last word.
Hi, my name is Bruce Rosen, and I'm a lay person, and I don't see where there's an antitrust system working in this country or globally where we have the concept of too big to fail profoundly over the globe with hyperbanks and other institutions over here. So I wish you would enlighten me where this is actually working, because that's why we have this huge concentration of wealth and whole countries being wrung out.
I don't think that the whatever the standards are undergirding too big to fail apply to Comcast, for example. Now, there may be issues in the financial markets, and I suspect that if you want to look for blame there, I wouldn't look at the antitrust economics or even the antitrust enforcement agencies. I would probably look a lot higher up the chain, like to the White House and at least to the Federal Reserve. There are a lot of people with a lot of interest in treating those banks very differently than perhaps the antitrust authorities would. I don't know that the antitrust authorities would have actually found there to be some actual economic basis for breaking up the banks, but I can guarantee you that there were a lot of political reasons why they didn't. This is not an antitrust problem.
All right, I think being revealed in this panel, and a lot of the debates that are going on in society today, is a divide as to, at the more fundamental level, as to whether we, business as usual, whether the system we've had in antitrust, in telecom regulation, where we have a faith in competition to displace regulation, where we're not really worried about monopoly, or we have this very narrow definition of what a monopoly is with the antitrust laws, and we have kind of weak, flaccid enforcement ever since the Reagan administration. And and everything's been great, and we should continue that, which is, maybe I'm exaggerating, but you're sort of saying we have good system, things are working well. And people like me who thinks it's time for change and that our system has failed, and we have a serious problem of inequality in this country, which is exacerbated by the failure of the government to take serious action in antitrust, serious action to restrain cable monopolies and to stop mergers like Time Warner Comcast, and start thinking about what are the day-to-day costs that Americans are facing. How is this economy working for normal middle-class people? I think our existing system has done some good things, has created some wealth, but has failed the middle class, and therefore I think we really need to re-examine from the bottom up things like how we regulate the largest carriers, and how we really enforce the antitrust law. And I have very strong feelings about that, and it's a different opinion on this panel.
It's a great stump speech.
You can have
but
30 seconds for a last word. Or you can just agree with him.
I do agree with him, but I would just say the internet has gone from being a lucky accident to the network that connects all the networks. It is the functional equivalent of the dial tone of the 21st century. Right now, there's a kid sitting on the stoop of a public library branch somewhere in Upper Manhattan who can't afford internet access at home and is sitting there because they're getting free Wi-Fi that leaks out of the library even after the library is closed. People can't even apply for jobs today if they don't have a way of getting online. So when people go to public libraries, the first major use in the library when someone signs up to use the computer is to figure out how to put in their resume and apply for a job. This is essential to our economic lifeblood. And the idea that we should sort of take a blasé, hands-off, let the big boys figure it out approach, I think is not one that we can afford.
Great. Well, this was not billed as a debate, but it was a very good one. I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you.
Very well done. Very well done. Of course I had to come to the gym. What do you say?
Well done.
It's disingenuous.